Hi everyone. Welcome to our Back to School Wi-Fi Optimization webinar with Wibot. I'm Christine Tobin, Manager of Customer Success. We're thrilled to have each and every one of you here today joining us from different parts of the country. This session is exclusively held for our education customers who we know are just beginning a new school year, and we hope you all have an excellent school season. Over the next hour, we'll have an engaging session lined up for you, packed with valuable insights, practical tips, and time for interactive Q&A. Our expert Wi-Fi engineers, Jacob and Adam Wilson, yes, they are related, will present strategies and insights to help you. They'll help you gain a better understanding of Wibot's cutting-edge technology, identify Wi-Fi challenges and issues. They'll discuss common configuration mistakes, and show you how to establish a great testing framework for ongoing monitoring. Please use the Q&A feature as they go along, and your questions will be answered. And at the end of the technical portion, we'll also allow for additional time for Q&A. So without further ado, let's dive in. And Jacob, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, excellent. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen first of all and make sure that works. Okay.
Looks good.
Awesome. All right. Well, yeah, thanks everybody for attending, right? So as Chris said, right, we're going to really focus on, what I call Wi-Fi optimization today, right? Everybody's coming back to school now, right? So I'm sure everybody's Wi-Fi network was probably working great over the summer when there weren't, many clients or hardly any clients connected to it. But now that you get that extreme density, of Wi-Fi radios coming in, it's certainly worth looking at some things to optimize, right? So I guess first of all, a little bit about me, right? For those who haven't met me yet, I'm sure I've spoken with at least a handful of you. I'm the sales engineering manager here at Wibot, right? So really that just means, I work with a team of, really talented, Wi-Fi engineers to help people understand Wibot, help people get the best value out of Wibot. So that's kind of my role here, right? My background before, being at Wibot, I worked in, a few different companies, MSPs, things like that, managing Wi-Fi deployments, supporting Wi-Fi networks, in several different verticals, right? So I do have quite a lot of experience with, different vendors and all the quirks that you see around that. And I live in Phoenix, Arizona, so kind of still trying to survive here. I think we're approaching fall, but that doesn't really mean anything to us until we're, I guess, late October is when it starts to cool down a little bit. So anyway, just, for those who are not here, enjoy your nice weather, I guess. Anyway, so I guess let's talk about Wi-Fi and education a little bit, right? Obviously, everybody here has Wi-Fi systems that they need to support. And as we all know, right, it's mission critical, right? It continues to be so, and I'm sure it will continue to be that way in many years to come. For a few reasons, right? I mean, obviously you have one-to-one computing now, right? Many schools are doing this where every single student is going to have a Wi-Fi connected device that they use for, most of their learning activities, right? Chromebooks, iPads, right? Some schools even use Mac, MacBook Airs, things like that. But the point is, right, every single student is going to have at least, right, at minimum one Wi-Fi client, right? So that's not counting cell phones, right? Apple Watches, list goes on, right? I mean, everybody's got many Wi-Fi devices now. In addition to human beings that are using your Wi-Fi network, you also have IoT systems. You have your HVAC systems, your security cameras, your door locks, right? All that stuff. Many of these things are actually going through your Wi-Fi, right? So, it even kind of fits into other parts of the operation beyond just, education. And then of course, many of the things that you're using, right, for learning are out on the internet, right? It's standardized testing, your student information system, Canvas, Blackboard, Infinite Classroom, right? All these things, productivity suites, G Suite, Office, right? That's all cloud-based these days. And how do people get to the cloud? Well, they get to it through Wi-Fi, right? I mean, it would be nice if everybody had an Ethernet cable they could just plug in at their desk. Unfortunately, most schools have not spent that much money to wire everything up, so people are using Wi-Fi. Therefore, right, important to be aware of that fact and also keep it optimized, right? So What is Wi-Fi optimization? What do I mean by that? Well, every Wi-Fi network is going to need to be tweaked to some extent, right? Wi-Fi is not one size fits all, of course, right? So why does it need to be tweaked? Well, you're going to have different device types that need to connect to your network, right? You're going to have Chromebooks, iPads, IoT systems, like I said. And these devices may have different requirements, right? For example, if you're talking about maybe a system that needs to do voice over Wi-Fi, right? Well, that's going to have a lot more, I would say, stringent requirements, especially around things like roaming, right? Than you're going to see with maybe just people with, for example, laptops, and they sit down, they do their work, and then they get up and move. Well, roaming is, important, but it's not nearly as important if you're going to be on a voice call while you're on, right? So there's different requirements there. Building construction is going to affect your coverage, right? So even, maybe one building was built in the 90s and it's all stick built drywall, right? And then you have another building that was built in the 50s and it kind of acted as a bomb shelter during the Cold War, right? And obviously, right, the wall construction is going to greatly affect your coverage, and that's going to inform some decisions you might make about configuration. Same thing with AP density, right? If you're doing an AP in every classroom, which is very common these days, you're going to want to look at things like transmit power to make sure you don't have, I don't want to say too much coverage, right? But you want the coverage cells to, to taper off as people walk around, because you want them to roam, right? And we'll talk more about that later. And the biggest thing with optimization, I would say, is especially those of you who have recently spent, a whole bunch of E-rate money or whatever it is on a full new network refresh, right? New access points, new switches, new routers, et cetera, right? Well, to get the most out of your investment and to hopefully have it be a step forward and not a step back, right? In a lot of cases, you're going to need to do some, do a little bit of work, optimizing it. So really, to get the most out of the money, we need to spend some time and pick the optimal settings. Okay. So here's some parameters I would say that we're going to focus on today, right? And these are the things that any network, you need to kind of think about these metrics, right? So a big one at the top here, channel planning. Okay. What do I mean by that? Well, channel planning is basically deciding how your access points are going to assign channels, because Wi-Fi, right, as many of you know, right, it's a wireless protocol that operates on different channels, right? So we're going to talk about this later on, but that's going to be things like channel width selections, using DFS channels. We'll talk about what those are. And really the goal of channel planning as a whole is to avoid what we call co-channel interference, where you have other APs in earshot of each other that are, on the same channel, right? And that results in overhead, because there's more chatter on that channel than there, otherwise might be. Okay. So another parameter I'm going to talk about a little bit is data rates. Okay. Specifically your minimum data rate. Now this is a little more, I would say, complex of a topic. And it's, to be honest, it's something that's often overlooked, right? I see a lot of networks where people spend a lot of time, adjusting, channel plans, transmit powers, SSID availability, et cetera. But, they never really looked at the data rates because, to be honest, it's just not something that's commonly known in a lot of, education out there. Or it ends up being something that gets pushed towards the advanced, section of all your Wi-Fi 101 classes. And, you don't hear about it as much. But basically the idea is a lot of modern APs have backwards compatibility for ancient, in terms of Wi-Fi standards, like 802.11b. Okay. Now we are in 2023, right? And 802.11b has been outdated since 2003, 2004, right? GE started to come on the market. And the point being is you don't normally need to support these 802.11b rates. So we'll talk about that. And really the reason you want to do this is to help with airtime congestion. Okay. A common issue we see is like an excessive amount of multicast or broadcast traffic on the network. And the reason that becomes so excessive in a lot of cases is because APs will retransmit all that traffic at whatever is the lowest configured data rate, right? So raising that data rate is very important to minimize congestion. Okay, we're going to talk about transmit power, right? So, you can obviously configure transmit power on enterprise grade APs. And, really what you're going to want to do that for is especially for roaming issues, right? Oftentimes what you run into is you might have heard this term, right? A sticky client, where it's not moving from one AP to another. Well, why isn't it moving? Well, the client decides when to move, right? And a lot of times it's because it's just, it still sees the AP it was connected to, like, 40 feet down the hall at a really strong signal strength, or relatively strong signal strength, right? So it won't roam. So you get sticky clients. So lowering transmit power can be a good way to fix that. And also it's important to understand, right? Wi-Fi communication is bidirectional, right? So the AP obviously has to talk to the client, but the client also has to talk to the AP, right? And you can configure your AP's transmit power. Almost always you cannot touch your Wi-Fi client transmit power, right? So it's kind of important to not get in the situation where the client can hear the AP, but the AP can't hear the client, and that can happen with transmit power settings that are a little bit too aggressive. So we'll get into that. And lastly here, avoiding 2.4 gigahertz. Right, we really want to stay away from 2.4. It's just simply not there's not enough bandwidth there, right, to support a large dense Wi-Fi network. There's too many devices that are still kind of sitting on 2.4 that don't need to be there. And there's also lots of things that cause interference, right? So we'll give you some methods that you can use to hopefully accomplish that that goal, right? It's easier said than done, just like everything, but we'll definitely give you some pointers there. All right, and all these pointers, by the way, I'm going to give you are going to also give you some tips around how to use YBot, right? To help you get there, to help you kind of analyze where you're at currently. So just to give everybody a brief overview, to make sure we're all on the same page with with the YBot technology and some of the features it has. We're multi-radio, we're vendor agnostic. So let me go to some of these slides that actually show you. So vendor agnostic, right? What I mean by that is you can stick a YBot sensor in really any Wi-Fi environment, and we're going to work with all these different vendors, even if it's multi-vendor, right? So here's a screenshot of our sensor. We're seeing some Extreme, some Meraki, some Ubiquiti, right? So all these vendors, they all use Wi-Fi just the same, right? So we're able to kind of determine, what's going on different vendors and give you some feedback around that. Automated issue detection, right? Really big part of our solution. When you deploy these sensors, they give you a list of problems, right? And they want to tell you how to fix it with a solution. And this is, think of it like kind of a punch list, right? Of things you might want to address with your, with your configuration, with maybe neighboring devices causing interference. So that's a really big part of the solution that can help you quickly optimize, your Wi-Fi network. Active testing, right? So the sensor can actually act as a client, right? So it can connect to your network, run a variety of different tests. You can put in URLs for your different statewide testing websites, for example, and will actually connect through your network, through the Wi-Fi and the wired, and run tests, right? So that's a big part of our solution as well. And then notifications, right? So the sensor can actually be triggered to alert you on a whole variety of different things. And that includes, test failures, maybe rogue APs being detected, things like that. So that's another part of our solution that wanted to highlight here because, you don't always have to be logged into our dashboard in order to get value out of the technology. All right, it's just some tips, for those with Wi-Fi or YBot sensors, which I think most of you should have at this point, on how to use them, right? So we would hope everybody has enough sensors for optimal coverage. Of course, some of you, might have more of a smaller amount of sensors that you use in kind of key areas. But what I'd say is a few things, right? If you're going to deploy a sensor and you have the ability to do so, it is good to have it nearby an access point. Just because, from a wireless perspective, that's kind of where you're going to hear the best signal strength from all of the clients that are around, and kind of get a similar picture of the network to what your AP is seeing. So that can be useful for for information gathering. Of course, as long as you have it in an area where you have decent signal strength, right? So maybe underneath a desk or something in a classroom where the AP's in that room, it'll still work fine. It'll give you plenty of good data. But just wanted to mention, if you are running a cable, for example, and you want to know where to put the cable, I would say somewhere close to the AP. And why did I say optimal coverage? Well, the reason is, with optimal coverage, you have 24/7, right? Visibility into all these different areas of your network. And you don't have to go and move the sensors around, right? We want this to be a proactive solution for everybody. And the best way to do that is to have the sensors there all the time, listening and catching those intermittent events. All right. And the thing to avoid really is, with a sensor, try not to put it in an area where you just don't have any good Wi-Fi coverage. By that, I mean like a network closet with like thick walls, or, in the middle of a rack with a bunch of metal equipment. Well, we're an over-the-air monitor, right? So blocking a lot of that RF signal might result in, not seeing as much data as you might want. So it's good to have these sensors, at the very least, nearby wherever the issues are happening, for your network. All right, so let's go ahead and move on and start talking about some optimization, right? Let me get a drink of water real quick too. All right, so channel planning, right? I mentioned that earlier, and again, really the goal of channel planning is to have a network where you have no co-channel interference, right? No APs that can hear each other on the same channel. And of course, not always possible, especially with 2.4 gigahertz, but the goal is to get as close as possible to that, ideal, right? But just here's some, general guidelines, right? On your 5 gigahertz band, this is where you're going to be able to select channel width options, and that's a very important parameter. And it's important to use the appropriate channel width for your environment, right? So what I mean by that is depending on your Wi-Fi density, right? You might not be able to use 40 megahertz channels because you just have too many APs, right? So you need to kind of look at your environment and use the data you have to understand which channel width to use. Use DFS channels whenever you can. Okay, we'll talk about what those are, but basically there's certain channels on 5 gigahertz that sometimes you need to enable some settings to use, but they're very important because it's a lot of bandwidth that you're exposing. And then on 2.4 gigahertz, you can only use channels 1, 6, and 11, right? It just is what it is. I know, it's a bummer because there's a lot of channels, or it seems like there's a lot more channels than there really are, but and we'll explain why, but you really only have these 3 that you can use. And here's just a little diagram just to explain kind of the, the overarching concept behind channel planning. Is you can kind of see somewhat of a honeycomb pattern. And, again, this is 2.4 just because there's fewer channels, so it's easier to explain with a diagram here. But essentially, you're seeing like channel 1 in this area, right, is not touching channel 1 in any other area, right? Now, here's a case where we actually do see some overlap, right? And you see that's where these 2 APs can hear each other. And, what's going to happen is a lot of the transmissions from the clients and from the APs are going to be heard on both of them. And then you're going to get higher airtime use than you otherwise would normally see, right? So here's an example of a WiBot alert you might see that would tell you need to look at your channel plan and potentially make some changes. So what this is saying is there's an optimal 5 gigahertz channel plan that's just not being used in this case. Why are we saying that? Well, you can see here the solution text does actually explain a little bit about that. In this case, we see some 80 megahertz APs, and also DFS channels are disabled, right? So it's kind of a double whammy of problems there. And what you get is only 2 channels. So you get a whole bunch of overlap with neighboring APs. So the solution is either, start using DFS or, drop your channel width to kind of optimize for that. So that's just an example of something you might see on WiBot. So if you do see this alert, that's telling you might need to make some changes around some of the settings that I'm going to talk about here. Okay, so channel width, right? That's a really big, option that you need to think about. There's 3 channel widths. I mean, technically there's 4, right? There's 160 megahertz, but that's not, just don't even look at it, right? That you don't ever want to use that. But there's 3 primary channel width choices you'll see. Okay, you'll have 20 megahertz, right? And 20 megahertz is what you call the base channel width, right? So your 5 gigahertz band is going to be split into 20 megahertz wide channels. Now, when 802.11n came out, right, we got options for bonding those channels together to increase throughput, right? So you could do a 40 megahertz channel. And then also, it is possible to do 80 megahertz channels. Okay. Now, what I would say is in a school building, you basically will never want to use 80 megahertz. Okay. That's just the nature of there not being enough channels, to support a stable environment with 80 megahertz. And then, as I said, 160 megahertz is just, it's just not usable. Just don't use it. I think most AP vendors don't even let you turn it on. It's in the standard, like it exists, but nobody will generally be using this. Okay. So let's talk about our different options here. 20 megahertz. Okay. And by the way, right, I should clear this up. This is only, I'm talking about 5 gigahertz here. 2.4 gigahertz, you'll never want to use any sort of channel bonding ever. You'll only ever want to use 20 megahertz there. So we're really only talking about 5 gigahertz channels right now. Okay. So a 20 megahertz channel width, just some numbers for you. There's 25 available channels, assuming you have all of your DFS channels turned on. Okay. So you'll have 25 channels. Now, if you can't run DFS for some reason, right, you could go with 9. There's a total of 9 without DFS. But you see, obviously, this is the highest number of channels you're going to get. And this is best for high density environments. Okay. And really, most schools you would classify as a high density Wi-Fi environment. Why? Well, the number of clients, right? There is a huge amount of clients, and the clients are pretty active, right? They're definitely using the Wi-Fi, maybe more often than you might see like in, I don't know, like a Starbucks or a public Wi-Fi out in like a mall, right? No, you have active clients, right? So you have a high density environment. So that's why, I'm going to argue that 20 megahertz is probably where you're going to want to most likely have your channel width set to. Just to give you some ideas on typical throughput, right? So that's what's going to change with the channels is the total throughput you have. And that's the reason why some people go with wider channel widths. But just to give you an idea, right, you're typically going to see approximately 100 megabits per second. If you did, for example, like a speed test on a 20 megahertz channel, assuming there's no bandwidth throttling on the back end or, a limitation at the internet circuit. So, that's actually, and I'll explain why 100 megabits is completely sufficient for, general use Wi-Fi. You really don't see problems with bandwidth being overutilized. And this is also applying to 802.11 AC devices, or newer, right? If you're talking like an 802.11, A device, like a really old legacy device, it can't support 100 meg because it doesn't support those higher data rates. But modern devices will get approximately 100 megabits per second. All right, 40 megahertz. Okay, now we're kind of getting into maybe more of a moderate density deployment, or okay, you might be in a situation where you really do need the high bandwidth. Okay, but with 40 megahertz, you essentially cut your number of channels in half, actually -1, so it's 12, because there's one channel that just doesn't fit with a 40 megahertz on 20 megahertz. So you get 12 channels, okay, and that's with DFS turned on. Without DFS, though, you only get 4, right? So if you can't run DFS, I mean, I would really suggest that you really can't run 40 megahertz, to be honest, because you just don't have enough channels there. So anyway, like I said, moderate density, high bandwidth requirements. And, the typical throughput, again, estimated numbers, Wi-Fi throughput is there's a lot of variables involved, so it's hard to give you a guaranteed, right? But on the high end, you might get about 200 megabits per second with a modern Wi-Fi client on 40 megahertz, right? So approximately twice as fast, right? But again, we're going to talk about why that's not as big of an upgrade as you might think in a second. And then 80 megahertz, okay, yeah, it is faster than 40 megahertz, but you only get 6 channels. And if you're not running DFS, you only get 2 channels. So what you're going to run into is significant interference and a significantly worse noise floor if you use 80 megahertz. So it's really never worth it to do that, in a school, right? Obviously you could say, oh, there's an edge case where I have a separate building that's out in the middle of a field that only has, 3 APs installed. And there's nothing nearby, sure, use 80 megahertz. But if you're in a normal, environment where you have, 50, 100 APs in a building, you shouldn't be using 80. It's just not easy to support that. All right, so let's talk about, speed, right? Throughput. What do you actually need? Okay, so here's some statistics that we gathered, just do some research with, some common, Chromebooks, iPads type applications you're going to see in a school. All right, so how much do you really need? Well, let's take a look. All right, here's some statistics we have. For example, let's talk about a Google Meet session, right? Video conferencing, and that's really one of the higher bandwidth applications you're going to see, in a typical situation, right, in a school. If you look at this, right, HD video, right? It's outbound 3.2 meg, inbound 1.8 meg, right? And that's I think that's more of a group meeting, right? But pretty low, right? Not nearly as high as the 100 megabits per second that you're going to max out at on 20 megahertz. And then audio only, it's like hardly any at all. It's just in the order of kilobytes. Right. And then, I think one-on-one meetings may be a little bit different because of the way the video is displayed, but still it's maybe 2.6 megs you need versus 1.8 meg, right? So still very, very low bandwidth utilization there. Okay. YouTube, right? Again, not nearly as much as you're going to have available with the 20 megahertz channel. I mean, with HD video, it's only like 5 megabits per second. Right. And I think that's assuming like, live stream and out without any buffering. 20 megabits per second for 4K. Right. I mean, obviously that uses a lot more. I mean, how many Chromebooks out there have 4K displays? Right. Same thing with iPads. It's, so I don't think you need to plan for 4K video. But even if you are planning for 4K, I would say you're still able to do that because you're below the 100 megabits per second threshold I mentioned earlier with 20 megahertz. Okay. What else did I have in here? Just some more stats around, video bandwidth, et cetera. And these are really the high bandwidth applications you're going to see. I mean, everything else you do on the internet is just minuscule compared to this. Loading websites, reading emails, right? It's almost a non-issue as far as throughput goes. Netflix. I mean, I have a lot of these slides, I guess. The point is, right? You probably don't need as much throughput as you think. So you're probably okay to use 20 megahertz channels, right? Your bottleneck is almost never really going to be the bandwidth you're getting on Wi-Fi necessarily. It's probably more likely going to be the airtime use, which is a little bit different. If you have a lot of co-channel interference, your channel might be too busy, then your throughput's going to go down. And the way to fix co-channel interference is actually to use a more narrow channel width typically. So that's kind of the my 2 cents there. Hopefully that was at least somewhat informative, and we'll have Q&A at the end, so we can definitely talk about that a little bit more. All right, so DFS channels, I mentioned it a couple times so far. What are they? So the 5 gigahertz band has this, you might call it a quirk to it, where there's a bunch of channels that you'll hear referred to as DFS sometimes. So basically, I think the history on this is, I don't know, I think it somewhat coincided with 802.11n coming out, but a lot of the spectrum on 5 gigahertz was previously not allowed to be used for Wi-Fi. Why? Well, the FCC was using these frequencies, radar uses these frequencies, and they really were concerned that if you started allowing Wi-Fi devices to use these channels, you're going to start seeing interference with, like military applications, right? Which obviously, the lawmakers in the U.S. do not want to, trample on that stuff, right? So for a while, they weren't allowed to be used. However, they did come with a system where these channels can be used. Okay. However, there's some quirks around them. What I would say is, in a lot of cases, what you're going to find out is your access points might not have these channels turned on. Oftentimes, there's actually a toggle you need to find through the UI on your wireless controller to enable support for these channels before they can be used. Okay. The other thing you might run into with these is what some controllers will call it like a DFS event or a radar event. Basically, access points that are using these channels have to listen. They have to listen for what looks like, what might look like a radar to them. If they do hear radar on one of these channels, they actually, by law, okay, they have to switch their channel to like, channel 44, for example, just a non-DFS channel. So I know that sounds pretty, scary. It's not that bad of a thing. what I'd say is the AP is going to switch its channel. Most clients are going to be okay with that. They're going to reconnect on the other channel. Although, you know, it might cause a brief disruption. All right. So what I would say if you're going to use DFS is monitor, right? Turn those channels on, maybe in a part of your building, and watch your controller for a week or two and kind of look for any logs that would point to a DFS event. And if you're seeing them, you know, consistently on the same channel, what you can do, like, for example, if they're always on channel 120, well, that doesn't mean you need to shut off all the DFS channels. It just means you might need to shut off channel 120. Okay. So don't throw the whole, you know, baby out with the bathwater, you know, if you see some events there. The other benefit I'd say to DFS channels is it's really uncommon to see consumer grade Wi-Fi equipment use these channels. So if you're in a residential area where you're seeing all of your neighbors, you know, home Wi-Fi networks, right? You know, all the comedians that Google funny Wi-Fi names, and you see like, I don't know, a pretty fly for a Wi-Fi, right? And stuff like that. And it's always on like channel 36 or channel 149, always, because those things will not use DFS channels for the Wi-Fi channels they use. So if you use the DFS channels, what you're going to find is these channels are much cleaner, right? There's much less interference frequently, you know, when you make use of them. So just wanted to point that out, right? I definitely suggest at least experimenting with to see if you can use the channels, and most environments totally can, right? And you're going to get some operational improvement by making use of them. Okay, so talked about 5 gigahertz. All right, let's talk about 2.4 a little bit. Nobody likes 2.4, right? At least here at Ybot, we don't really, you know, 5 gigahertz is just, you know, better, right, for wireless performance in a modern network. But you know, we do still have to support it, you know. And so let's talk about the kind of the attributes with that band. So there are technically 11 channels that you're going to have available here in the US of A. I think some other countries will have like channel 14, so you get a few more channels, but doesn't really make a difference because there really are only 3 non-overlapping channels available: 1, 6, and 11. So notice that I said non-overlapping channels. So let's look at this little diagram down here. So you see the kind of little parabolic representation of channels. All right. So if you look at this, the channel width is 22 megahertz. And this is if you have 802.11b support turned on. If you have it shut off, it's 20 megahertz. But I think most networks will still need to support the B channel width in some cases. So it doesn't make a difference either way. 22 versus 20, it's still the same, 1, 6, and 11. But you'll see, like, you know, channel 6, well, if I use channel 8 and channel 6, they actually overlap with each other, right? The kind of dotted line here, you can see it sort of goes into this channel 6 here. So what'll happen if you start using all these other channels is you're going to get a ton of interference. So it's actually pretty destructive interference, because basically if I'm on channel 6 and somebody else is on channel 4 and I hear a bunch of their transmissions, well, I can't decode them because it's on a different channel. So it's just noise. And if you kind of look into the Wi-Fi standard, how it handles, you know, just signal, like energy versus like actual Wi-Fi, like decodable transmissions, it's not great. You know, you're gonna start to see a lot of collisions, a lot of, you know, throughput loss. So you do have to sacrifice all these other channels and just use 1, 6, and 11 to have a stable, you know, network on 2.4. So where are you going to see, you know, 2.4 used the most? I would think is these days probably IoT, right? A lot of the IoT manufacturers are going to use 2.4 only radios. Why? Well, they're less expensive, right? You know, a lot of this, it's kind of a commodity, right? You can get a 2.4 radio for very little money. You know, also power requirements, right? Sometimes they only want to support 1 band, and 2.4 allows for some lower data rates that take a little bit less power to transmit. So anyway, so that's kind of why you see a lot of the 2.4 on IoT, and also non-Wi-Fi devices, right? Sources of interference, microwave ovens, etc. So let's look at the next slide here. Here we go. Yeah, so avoiding 2.4 gigahertz, right? That should be a goal, I think, for anybody's Wi-Fi network. Right, because almost every device user facing is going to support 5 gigahertz, and like we talked about, all the issues on 2.4, little bandwidth, neighbors, etc., sources of interference. So We have a client distribution on WiBot that will show you if you have any clients on 2.4 that are 5 gigahertz capable. So here we see this screenshot shows, 38% of the clients that we were seeing at this point in time are actually 5 gig capable. They're dual band devices, but they chose 2.4 because it was available, right? So some devices are going to make that choice. So here's some methods you can use to mitigate that. Disable 2.4 on your user-facing SSIDs, right? You can set this per SSID typically, where you can say, okay, my student network only supports 5 gigahertz. Well, then you can leave 2.4 on for your IoT networks, or maybe your guest SSID where it's all BYOD and you don't really care about the quality of service so much there. Decrease transmit power on 2.4, right? So that's right. So one reason you see a lot of people on 2.4 is because it's often at a stronger signal strength, right? So decreasing the power is a good way to compensate for that difference and kind of minimize people connecting. And then also vendor specific options, right? So most vendors have something they'll call band steering. I think Cisco's going to call it band select. Same thing though, right? There's basically some methods that these vendors have to, in effect, steer the clients onto 5 gigahertz when they connect. So you have a dual band SSID, the device connects, it'll prefer 5 gigahertz more likely. It doesn't always work, but it's certainly better than nothing. So take a look at those settings and see if you have them turned on. And if not, maybe take a look at them. They can be pretty effective. All right, so we're moving right along, just watching the clock here. Yeah, we got time still. So data rates. What are data rates, right? So when I say data rates, I'm referring to a specific element of a Wi-Fi network where every SSID needs to have, I guess, required data rates that all the clients have to support. All right, there's some operational reasons because of this, but basically the point is extremely old devices. By that I mean 802.11b, right? So very, very old Wi-Fi devices. They operate at these slow and specific data rates that newer devices actually don't really need to use anymore. That's 1, 2, 5.5, and 11 megabits per second. Okay. Why is it good to raise your minimum data rates? Well, most management traffic from your access points, so your beacon frames, your probe responses, right? All that stuff is sent out of the minimum data rate. Whatever the lowest value is, that's where you're going to see that traffic get transmitted. Also, broadcast and multicast traffic, right? That again is going to be sent at the minimum rate in a lot of cases. So if you have issues with airtime use problems, especially due to things like Apple TVs or Chromebooks or Chromecasts, raising your minimum data rate is a good way to address that. And the reason why, right? The lower the data rate, the longer a frame takes to transmit. If I set something at 1 megabit per second, as you can imagine, it takes me a lot longer to get all my bits and bytes through the air if it's sent at 1 meg. So anyway, here's a screenshot. This is a Wireshark actually, and just to show you what I'm talking about. If you look at a beacon frame, there's a supported rates element, and this lists all your different data rates that are required. The B means basic, which also means required. So 1, 2, 5.5, 11. So this is an example of some legacy support, which you can shut off. We have a signature on WiBot as well to show you that. So if you see this legacy 802.11b data rates alert, that means there's some networks in the area that have B turned on. So if they're your SSIDs, you can configure that and remove support for them. Just some quick guidelines, right? It's configured per SSID, the data rate typically. So if you make the change on one SSID, you need to go through and make a change in all the other SSIDs that you want to configure that for. And just some recommended starting points. I would say most networks are perfectly happy with a 12 megabits per second minimum rate, right? And you can actually set that on both 2.4 and 5 gigahertz. So feel free to do that. There's really very little downside of making that change, and it can help with some of the overhead you might be seeing. If you have a dense deployment, AP in every classroom, you could even go up to 24 megabits per second, right? So even higher than 12. And of course, that just means all the traffic is sent even faster, so less risk of some of that overhead that we're talking about. But one thing to be wary of is setting this too high, right? If you're thinking, well, I want faster traffic all the time, right? Faster is better. Well, if you go up to like 54 megabits per second, for example, which is the highest rate most vendors might let you set, you're going to find out that a lot of clients start having really funky problems just because they need to. You want your minimum data rate to be something that's still easily demodulatable. 54 megabits per second it takes actually a pretty good signal strength to see that. So you might run into some really crazy issues that start happening. So I would say 24 is as high as you're generally going to want to go, but 12 is a good starting point. Here's a screenshot of what this looks like in a wireless controller. This is just Extreme Cloud IQ, I think. Yep. And so there's a couple options what you might see. Sometimes it's like a drop down where you just pick a number or a slider. Like I think Meraki and Ubiquiti are going to have like little sliders you can mess around with. And here's an example of one that's a little more complex. So you see you can set your like NA to get rid of the rates, basic for the required rate. So you always need to have at least one basic rate, and that should normally be your minimum rate, and then some other rates. So 12 and 24 is the most common thing you're going to see. So basic, and then everything else can be optional, right? But anyway, that's what it looks like in a UI. And we actually have some guides on our knowledge base with Ybot that have vendor specific instructions here. All right, so that's your data rates. We're going to talk about transmit power a little bit. So, right, transmit power, it's an important, attribute to look at. So why is it important? Well, first of all, reducing co-channel interference, right? If your transmit power is screaming hot on all your APs, right, your coverage cells are very large, and now your APs can hear each other, which is something you want to avoid, right? So it's good for that. Roaming, right? We talked about that. Sticky clients can get stuck because they don't want to roam because transmit power is too high. So it's important to know sometimes the default settings, which your vendors might use, are just too high, right? Just is what it is, right? A lot of these vendors, they kind of know that people deploy their access points, and maybe they do a like an echo house survey afterwards, and they want to see the green, the strongest signal strength. So they're just like, well, let's just crank the power. So our APs always look very very powerful, right? But you don't always, higher is not better with this. So, and like I said, bidirectional Wi-Fi communications, if your AP is at a much higher power than your clients, your client can get into a situation where it can hear the AP, but the AP can't hear the client. So you're going to have a really high retry rate if that happens. So again, not great. And it's lowering transmit power is generally the fix there. All right, so talk about roaming real quick. So roaming, in terms of Wi-Fi, right? It's a client decision, right? The client device is the one in control of the roaming process. And that presents a lot of problems, right? Because every client has different, what you might call a threshold for roaming. And usually, right, this is not documented, right? Most client vendors are not going to give you a nice little sheet that says, oh, we're going to roam at minus 73 dB and 20 SNR. No, you really don't know in a lot of cases. Now, some clients are a little bit better, like Windows, with Intel Wi-Fi radios, you can actually manually, well, not totally manually, but you can have some options for roaming thresholds. I think Apple has some good published documents on that explain some of this, but to be honest, it is still kind of, and it's not just signal strength, there's a whole bunch of other metrics that clients could use to choose an AP. But the point is, right, different clients are going to roam potentially at different thresholds. Like a laptop might say, oh, I'm going to hang on until minus 75. A cell phone might be like, oh, it's minus 70. Let's start looking for a new AP. So that's one thing I wanted to explain, right? Not every client is going to behave the same, which is, unfortunate, but kind of is what it is, right? So the important thing, though, is almost every client is going to consider signal strength when they roam. So if a client does not see the signal strength degrade, they're not going to roam, even if there's like a better AP available. If I still see an AP at minus 65 and I'm at one at minus 45 right above me, well, why would I roam? I still have minus 65. I can still communicate just fine, right? So that's kind of one reason, you need a lower transmit power for roaming to work. So a couple places you can look on Ybot for this. Well, I guess there's one place really that I wanted to share. Just to understand, what your coverage looks like is actually the access point tile. So if you click on your Ybot sensor and you see the access point list, it's going to pop up a big chart with all the different APs. You can sort that chart by signal strength. And that can help you understand, like, what's my coverage looking like as far as the closest AP, the next closest AP, so on and so forth. So here's an example in the screenshot where we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 APs. where the signal strength available on them is minus like 55 or above. Well, what does that mean? That means clients could be connected to any one of these APs, and they're not going to roam to any of these other APs in the area because, again, the signal strength is just too strong. There's no real reason for them to roam. So this could be a case where potentially lowering transmit power might help, encourage the clients to, connect to the AP that's in the classroom that they're, sitting in. Right. So here's another example. This looks a little bit better, right? We still see a close AP at very strong signal strength, minus 42. Another AP at fairly strong signal, but to be honest, it's good to have at least another, like a secondary AP that gives good coverage. Why? Well, if your main AP goes down or changes its channel or whatever it is, you want to have a fallback option so your clients aren't just kind of on an island with bad coverage. So you see like minus 42, then minus 62, then minus 70. So this is I would say a much better looking kind of a list of AP coverage, and that can kind of inform like, okay, well, our coverage looks pretty good, so our roaming should be better. Right. And as I said with roaming, it is a client decision at the end of the day. So it's very difficult to totally 100% guarantee that every client's going to roam consistently the way you expect it to. But, adjusting transmit power is really where you want to tweak, I think, to kind of get to that point. How did I do? 10 minutes left. All right. So Q&A. I think, Adam, if you're on the call here, if you want to take over from here, we will answer some questions that may be coming in, but I do appreciate everybody listening to me kind of run through some of these tips, and hopefully it was informative. So Adam, I'll let you take it from here.